The first person we see at the beginning of every wrestling match is someone announcing the rules and participants. These people are held in esteem and reverence as they tend to be considered the more classy of the people involved in the wrestling industry. And if you were to hear it from most, the first announcer employed by the McMahon family was Howard Finkel, and no one should ask about anything prior. Though it is mostly just not spoken of now. There was an announcer before Finkel, and there is a very good reason they would prefer to not discuss it.
How does it feel when your heart grows cold, 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 cold?
You can look far and wide, but you will find little of note about ring announcer Mel Phillips before he was with the World Wrestling Federation. He seemed to have just flown under the radar and landed in the role of ring announcer for the McMahon family's territory. He was passable, and no one really complained of his work at the time. The rumors and complaints, however, did come in very fast and were nothing to do with his work. The issues being brought to the table were that he was being very inappropriate with the young boys who put the ring together. This group would come to be known as the Ringboys, and they were said to endure awful things at the hands of Mel Phillips, only for the wrestlers to essentially have a laugh about the situation.
Mel Phillips, for a moment, he got kind of ensnared in the troubles that would come to light in years, a few years from then. I think 92 was when all the sex scandal stuff started coming out, and that his affinity for feet.
Yeah, I heard.
Never yours, I guess.
No, my feet are ugly, I guess, but.
And not on a 15-year-old either.
Yeah, so yeah, it was really fun. It was just kind of like a joke. I never really believed that someone that would actually like sucking toes unless it was some Playboy playmate or something, you know. But I heard that about Mel Phillips, and you heard a lot of strange things, you know, a lot of strange things that happened with the Ringboys and stuff like that.
Before we heard about this, being the general public in 92, was this always just kind of the joke, like, yeah, Mel Phillips, the foot guy? So
Yeah,
this was something that was known?
No one cared, you know. I mean, he wants to suck toes, let him, you know. Nobody cared. But all of a sudden now, you know, nowadays everybody cares about everything. They care, you know, they just, the media loves any kind of scandal, and it goes right along with our business of wrestling.
Well, I think in fairness, I think the problem was that some of the kids were quite young, right? Or maybe 14.
Yeah, I did hear that, and yeah, there's definitely a big problem with that. And I think before that, he was getting away with it because maybe the kids weren't that young, but then he got some younger kids involved.
Pro wrestling has always actively appealed to the demographic of person that Phillips would victimize, and he used this to his advantage in situations where he could recruit young boys to join the ring crew and become one of his ring boys.
You know, being a kid, not a ring rat, but I would go to the wrestling. Yeah, I went to wrestling. I really loved it. Anyway, in Maple Leaf Gardens, outside the curtain, the side entrance, like inside the building in the arena area, to where the wrestlers were, I was kind of hanging out there, you know, hoping to get a glimpse of somebody coming out, or, you know, I try to talk to the guys when I could. And a guy comes out from behind the curtain. He had a suit on and kind of looked like he worked with a promotion. He says hi to me. He goes, "Hey, what's doing?" I'm 13 years old, right? And I go, "Hey, good." And we started talking about wrestling a little bit. And then he started offering up information that I never knew. And then he said to me, he goes, "Yeah, I work with, I guess at the time it was WWF." I go, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah." We started talking a little bit more. He goes, "Here." This guy takes out a, man. This guy, he takes out it was kind of like a pinkish, light reddish wrestling ticket to, I think it was Philadelphia Arena, Auditorium, something. It's where they did the TV tapings for WWF. And he wrote his name, which was Mel Phillips, and an address. I'm going to say, I still remember Taney, T-A-N-E-Y, Taney Avenue, Boulevard Street, something like that. That was where he lived. He had his phone number on it. I gave him mine. I didn't, think much about it. He goes, hey, next time I get in town, we'll chat or something like that. I go, okay, because remember, I wanted to get into wrestling, right? So he called me from Philadelphia. I'm going to be in town. He goes, why don't you come down to, I got to say this, he says, why don't you come downtown, meet me at the hotel and we'll have lunch or whatever, right? Well, we'll go bowling, whatever it is, right? So anything we say today, Hannibal, whatever I say today, this is going to be the most important thing that I say. I sensed, any kids who are watching today, I had a sense that there was something kind of off about this. It didn't make sense to me, right? Why would this guy be interested in me? I was like 13 years old. He was in the business. What am I? Something about it in my security system went off, right? And I said to my mother, and also, like, I was the vintage, from what I understand, I was the poster boy for someone that he would prey on, because unfortunately my father split on us not too far before, a single family home. My mom was up to her neck and trying to make life work. So I was perfect for potential grooming into ultimately what he wanted to do. I sensed something was wrong, and so I said to my mother, I told my mom. So let me just say right now, kids, you kids out there, you have to trust yourself to see if something's wrong. And always, forget about cleaning up your room and doing your homework. Not that it's not important, but whenever it comes to a situation of safety for you kids, you gotta ask your mom or your dad. If you have both of them together, fantastic. Or if you have a guardian, a grandmother, a grandfather, uncle, whatever, you gotta trust wisdom. And wisdom comes from experience, not from kids. I knew that something was fishy about this. I told my mom. My mom goes, what does this guy want with you? Like, come on, something's wrong here. She goes, you know what? Invite him up for dinner. So Mel Phillips takes the subway up, into the Bathurst Manor, into the my Jewish neighborhood in Toronto. Mel Phillips comes in. My mom gave him hamburgers. And Mel was, I think he was a music teacher. And I think he played the organ in church. And, on the surface, it would seem to be a nice enough guy. My mom had spent her career as an educator, so they were talking about something like that. And then he left, and he wanted me to go downtown. And next time he came in town, he called me to come downtown to the hotel again. So I told my mother, and I wasn't the kind of guy who's going to ask my mom or tell my mother about everything, but I did sense that something's wrong here. I told my mom. And my mom says to me, he's a sedator. There's something really off about this guy. And I kind of agreed with her. She goes, you can go, but you have to take one of your friends with you. Call my buddy Elon, right, who was accused with me of sabotaging the George Cannon show. We went down and met Mel Phillips, Mel in the lobby of his hotel. I didn't tell Mel I was bringing a friend with. And I see that when I show up with another friend, I can see Mel is kind of like, he's kind of deflated a bit, So whatever, we went and got I don't know if we had lunch or I don't know if we went bowling. I don't even remember. But that was the last I saw of him. And years later, when we found out what this guy was, I don't know if you got to say allegedly or not, but we'll say allegedly for the sake of not getting sued, was up to. I thank God for my mom's being present as a parent. And for me, for asking her, and even for my own sense of, something was wrong here. You trust yourself. You got to trust yourself.
Not all of the young boys were as lucky as Mr. Cate. Phillips was able to carry out his routine of recruiting young boys and then shuffling them to his hotel room for years without disruption.
We were overseas one time, and there were a group of young little boys sitting out front of the hotel, and I asked somebody, I think I asked the warlord, what are these kids doing out here? He goes, the black ring announcer, what was his name?
Mel Phillips.
Mel Phillips
The guy that was fired.
says Mel's getting these kids tickets tonight, and for return, he takes them to the room and plays with their feet. And I go, what? You know, so it's like, and I can tell you a million stories like that.
Shane Douglas tells a particularly bad story about Mel Phillips and his conduct aboard an airplane.
So we're flying during the day, but on those flights, it's like a 7-hour flight. They'll feed you, then they tell everybody to put their window shades down, and the plane's completely dark and everybody goes to sleep because it's such a long flight. Well, I was up in first class. I'd gotten bumped up, and I was traveling with boss man, Ray Traylor. And during the flight, I'm not sleeping. I'm thinking, well, how come, the last thing you want to do is mill around the airport or, be at the last of the line to get your rental car or whatever. So in my head, I'm thinking, I'll jump right off the plane and go get the rental car. Ray, you go to the baggage claim, pick up the bags, and I'll pick you up when we get out of there. So I'm going back and I'm looking. I had seen Mel get on the plane earlier, and he comes on, walks past. Then, a couple of younger kids come on. And it was one of those things that didn't connect in your brain. They look very young, but you're thinking, well, they can't be, being flown around the country. The parents must know where they are, or they're older and just look younger, And so I get on, during the flight, the shades are all down, it's pitch black. So I'm going back trying to find Ray, and, it's dark, so I'm like sort of like really wincing. See, now, if Mel had just closed his eyes, I would have been paying attention. But as I walked by, Ray was sitting right behind him. As I walked by, I stopped, and what caught my attention was he was looking at me like this. Got a blanket for him, he's going, just staring at me. Well, why is he staring at me like that? Like frozen there for a second, then underneath the blanket, I see something going up and down. I was like, what the fuck? Seriously, dude? Like, what the fuck? And as I said, if he just closed his eyes, I wouldn't even paid attention. But him staring at me like that made me stop and stare for a minute. And I saw this. And years later at the ECW arena, there was a kid that was setting the ring up, and there was something scratching my brain. I knew this kid somehow. And I finally went down and was, hey man, what's your name? I know you, don't I? And he ran out of the building, and I never saw him again. That those monsters would do that to children. That kind of stuff to children, and do it so openly. You're on a plane with 300 other people. It's, you wonder if those are the things that you're looking at and you're seeing, here and there in that, when you're in that company. You then have to wonder, every night you're in a hotel, what's going on in this building.
Not every wrestler would look the other way, though, and many were vocally against what was going on with Mel Phillips. However, this would never materialize in any true justice on Phillips. A particular incident with Phillips and Terry Funk has become quite famous for getting to see Phillips get pummeled in the ring.
The women are very mistreated, but so are the guys, but you don't hear about it as much, because it's so common. Back in the day, before I was there, WWE was a playground for they only hired ring crew guys who were under 18. They wouldn't hire anybody over 18 because they were Mel Phillips and Pat Patterson. I'm not afraid to say those two names are perverts.
Well, didn't Mel Phillips have to get edited out of WrestleMania 3 and
Yes.
do a bunch of other stuff after that? What was he doing? He'd have kids in a bunch of different towns or something?
He had kids in every town, but he was a foot guy where they'd step on him while he jacked off and stuff, or vice versa, and some sick shit. And he didn't deny it. He just faded away. Fucking gross. Terry Funk beat him up one time because he put his hat on. He took Terry Funk's hat and put it on. Terry Funk beat his ass. Mike Spada, brother, does the ring crew for WWE. F. Not anymore, I don't think. He's from what I heard.
Really?
Yeah. He only hired young kids, young boys, not kids, boys. They had to be a boy.
That'd be interesting getting into wrestling and saying, I'll get you in, and then...
Yeah, and they get him in. They get him in the dressing room. They get him setting the ring up. Get him in a Coke and a popcorn and a dick. But Mel Phillips had somebody in every town. That's why he was so notorious.
With all of the scrutiny going around during the time, when the Ringboy scandal finally broke to the news, Mel Phillips was quickly let go from the company, and you don't hear his name spoken publicly by the Federation after that moment. Phillips was not brought back in his old capacity as Pat Patterson was, and was seen as such a liability that his departure was touted as some kind of catch, all to show that the company was clear of allegations.
Here are just some of dozens of pages of legal documents, allegations, threats, and bluster sent our way in an attempt to scare us off and prevent this investigation from airing. Allegations of teenage sexual abuse certainly can't help business when so much of the audience is comprised of children. Ironically, although they did prevent us from running the Thomas Cole interview, the affidavit filed for that effect by Thomas Cole and his lawyers provides perhaps the best evidence of precisely the kind of abuse this young man experienced. I'll quote from it. The interviews contain graphic descriptions of sexual abuse I sustained between the ages of 13 and 19, most of it between the ages of 13 and 16. This abuse has left me emotionally scarred.
What is your knowledge of the upper management of WWF using their power for sexual favors?
If they saw an opportunity, they would grab it. With the ring assistants, the ring boys, I can remember in Chicago, one of the ring assistants who was rather young came up to me and asked me about Terry Garvin and that he was kind of being harassed and asked for my advice on what he should do.
22-year-old Tom Cole was hired as a ring boy for the World Wrestling Federation when he was 13 years old. For the next 3 years, he says he was sexually abused by his supervisor, Mel Phillips, who Cole says has a foot fetish. And Cole says there were other abusers besides Phillips.
I was grabbed on numerous occasions in my testicles, on my buttocks by Pat Patterson of the World Wrestling Federation, and Terry Garvin propositioned me when I was 16, offered me cocaine and all kinds of drugs to have sex with him. When I refused, I was let go from the company when I was 16, and then I returned again when I was 19. I was let go again because I refused Terry Garvin's advances.
So Cole hired a lawyer and ended up with a $55,000 settlement to cover lost wages. As for Mel Phillips, he was fired from the company. But Cole's family says firing Phillips wasn't enough, and they were at the Stamford headquarters today demanding justice.
I would like to see Mel Phillips put behind bars where the hell he belongs. Because he's a child molester, the man. It's enough for him just to step down from his job. He's walking the streets, he's molesting children. The man should be put in jail.
World Wrestling Federation President Linda McMahon says an outside investigator concluded there was no evidence of Phillips molesting employees, but the company fired him anyway.
First, he was put on suspension pending investigation. The investigation was taking so long, there was so much negative happening with it that we finally told Mel that it was better for him and better for our company for him to go on in a different way.
McMahon doesn't deny Phillips had a foot fetish, but she said it had become a joke and was blown out of proportion.
You call a man filming your feet for hours at a time and playing with your feet and making you cry when you're only 13 years old and recording it for his own sexual purposes. If she calls that normal, then obviously there's something wrong with her also.
McMahon says she took a personal interest in Cole and tried to send him to counseling, encouraged him to get his high school equivalency, and finally offered to put him through Westchester Community College with a promise to come back and work for the company if he passed all his courses. She says she was greatly disappointed when he did none of the above.
We took an opportunity to help a young man who, for whatever reason, seemed confused, he seemed troubled, and wanted to have an opportunity in life, and we felt that we could help him.
It's a tortured, complicated story because the main accuser, a guy named Tom Cole, has flipped so many times on this. He was an accuser, he settled with them on the eve of shooting a Phil Donahue show. That was a talk show of the period where they had a bunch of people on talking about the scandals that were in the air then. And if Tom Cole had come forward then, it could have been very devastating for the company. But they bought him off, and he actually went to work for WWF. Then he got fired at some point later, and he flipped again and was accusing again. Then when I was writing about it during Linda McMahon's first Senate race in Connecticut in 2010, when my book on Benoit and all the things that I'd written about WWF became a big part of the oppo research for Linda McMahon's, both her primary opponents and her general election opponent, who became the now Senator Richard Blumenthal. During that period, Tom Cole flipped again and said he liked McMahon's and they treated him well. So, who knows? But you've got the stories about others, not Tom Cole, driving fancy cars after that period that they had been given. And we have a number of other holes and other stories of ring boys. Certainly Mel Phillips was a very, very bad guy who kept a black book of ring boys that he contacted on tour, who helped tear down and set up the ring and do other gopher tasks on the WWF tour. And these boys all came from and they were boys exclusively, all came from broken homes. And it's a pattern that those of us, and I've done a lot of sexual abuse, awful stories in settings other than WWE, primarily in USA Swimming and other youth sports where there's a terrible problem of coach sexual abuse. The predators prey on vulnerable kids, and Mel Phillips fit that pattern to a T, and he was a very bad guy. And certainly Terry Garvin sexually harassed Tom Cole. I think the facts that I've written about make that very clear too. No matter how many times Tom Cole himself has gone back and forth and things that he said on the record at various points.
The investigation into Mel Phillips was always thought to have been fumbled in some way, and it wasn't until just a few years ago a request to the FBI would reveal our worst fear. They had evidence, they even had a videotape, but it seems they were more concerned with taking down Vince McMahon for something than investigating what was going on with the Ring Boys. In these new documents, a former employee is proven to have had a tape that he had made while working there. Such a revelation is probably shocking to most, but that's only the beginning. Mel Phillips was also doing what he was always accused of in this videotape. And what makes it all crazier, they declined to pursue the tape, and the files show they decided to cooperate with Mel Phillips to go after Vince McMahon. After seeing Phillips as someone they could possibly flip to go against McMahon, shockingly, the videotape that was of such interest not so long ago was no longer of any real interest and could be hand-waved.
Nobody ever gets to talk to you, do they, huh?
The video was ignored and to this day has not been publicly commented on by any parties. It seems like many of the Ring Boys, this one just wants to forget and says he traded the tape to the World Wrestling Federation in exchange for some autographs for his son, giving an ending that just leaves far too many questions in its wake. A copy of the tape had been sent to Fairfax Consultants. If that name sounds familiar to you, then you remember this.
Want it in my organization. I don't want it. I'd like to reiterate the question. Do you believe there is sexual harassment amongst the wrestlers or employees of the World Wrestling Federation today? There is a possibility of that. That's why I have these independent investigators to come in. And who are these independent investigators? Fairfax Group Limited.
All of a sudden, I'm even less confident in how the tape investigation was handled.
You saw Ring Boys, did you, being sexually harassed?
Yes, I've seen Ring Boys being sexually harassed.
It just seems as though they're all ganging up on us at one time. These are people with active authority. Yes. They would like to see you fail. Question.
Sometimes when someone gets investigated, it leads to a more disappointing end than if it hadn't been looked into at all. For all anyone knows, Phillips was able to live quietly and without much incident until he would die. In that time period, he could have very well not offended or harmed anyone, but in many people's view, it is much more likely he was let go to do as he wished again, but this time with a little more knowledge on how to not get caught. Mel Phillips is an anomaly of wrestling in that there is so little information about him, but there is little mystery in whether or not he was what many said he was, as even Vince McMahon was on record of telling Phil Mushnick that Phillips had an unnatural attraction to young boys and was hired back to help behind the scenes until 1992 with the provision that he, and I quote from what was told to Mushnick here, "Stay away from kids." McMahon said this all the way back in 1988, and the company didn't part ways with Phillips until 1992. Phillips was the type of person that most wrestling fans don't know or will never care to know about, and that is understandable. The reason his story is so important to speak on isn't because it's a pleasant one to hear, but the opposite. A man preying on vulnerable people with promises of meeting the famous people they saw on television in exchange for silence. The only resolution or silver lining to the story of Mel Phillips is that there is no more Mel Phillips.